हाय एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय चैनल। दिस इज़ मानसरी थोड़ी। सो एज यू नो हम पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी सीरीज़ कर रहे थे। सो आज की वीडियो में हम करने वाले हैं मार्क्स, माओ और लेनिन। सो विदाउट एनी फर्दर डू लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड। सो वन बाय वन हम तीनों को डिस्कस करेंगे। सो सबसे पहले हम बात करेंगे मार्क्सिज्म आया कहाँ से। मार्क्सिज्म देखिए 19th सेंचुरी में आया जब क्लासिकल लिबरलिज्म हाई स्टेज पर था और कैपिटलिज्म का पूरी तरीके से एस्टैब्लिशमेंट हो चुका था। सो बेसिकली इंडस्ट्रियल प्रोग्रेस की वजह से सोसाइटी में जो भी नई नई प्रॉपर्टी आती थी वो कुछ एक कैपिटलिस्ट के हाथों में रह जाती थी, जिसकी वजह से वर्किंग क्लास का एक्सप्लॉयटेशन किया जाने लगा। ओके, सो कैपिटलिज्म होता क्या है? देखो, पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम में जो भी सोशल प्रोडक्शन मीन्स होते हैं लाइक लैंड, बिल्डिंग्स, मिनरल सोर्सेज, फॉरेस्ट, स्टेट्स, प्लांट्स, फाइनेंस, सो ये प्रोडक्शन मीन्स प्राइवेट ओनरशिप में रहते हैं और इनका जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन होता है वो प्राइवेट प्रॉफिट के ऑब्जेक्टिव से किया जाता है। ओके, और ये किससे जुड़ी होती है? मार्केट इकोनॉमी से, जहाँ पर बहुत ज़्यादा कंपटीशन भी होता है। ओके, अब हम बात करेंगे कार्ल मार्क्स के बारे में। कार्ल मार्क्स जो थे वो जर्मन फिलोसोफर थे और वो कैपिटलिज्म के अगेंस्ट थे। ओके, देखिए कार्ल मार्क्स ने कुछ आर्टिकल्स लिखे, कम्युनिस्ट मैनिफेस्टो, क्रिटिक ऑफ पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी और कैपिटल। सो इनके थ्रू उन्होंने क्या किया? सोशलिज्म में दो तरीके की चेंजेस करने की कोशिश की। सबसे पहले उन्होंने यूटोपियन सोशलिज्म यानी स्वप्नदर्शी, यूटोपियन मतलब होता है मतलब कि अपने इमेजिनेशन के फॉर्म में जब भी कोई चीज़ की जाती है उसको यूटोपियन कहा जाता है। उसमें उन्होंने क्या किया? यूटोपियन सोशलिज्म को टारगेट किया और साइंटिफिक सोशलिज्म की नींव रखी। सो बेसिकली उन्होंने क्या किया? फिलॉसफी ऑफ हिस्ट्री के बेस्ड पर सोशलिज्म के डेवलपमेंट पर मेन फोकस किया और उसे कम्युनिज्म के रास्ते पर ले जाने की कोशिश की। ठीक है, सो मार्क्स ने 19th सेंचुरी के यूरोप में कैपिटलिज्म से जुड़े हुए लिबरल थॉट को चैलेंज किया और नए सोशल, इकोनॉमिक और पॉलिटिकल थॉट्स को बढ़ावा दिया, जिससे क्या हुआ? मार्क्सिस्ट थॉट की ट्रेडिशन जो है शुरू हो गया। ओके, सो आज का जो युग है इसमें हम जब पढ़ते हैं फिलॉसफी, इकोनॉमिक्स जब हम पढ़ते हैं, सोशलॉजी जब हम पढ़ते हैं, पॉलिटिकल साइंस पढ़ते हैं, लिटरेचर पढ़ते हैं, किसी भी फील्ड में हम जब कोई भी चीज़ें पढ़ते हैं तो मार्क्सिस्ट जो है हमारा सब्जेक्ट ज़रूर होता है। ओके, देखिए अब हम कुछ इश्यूज देखेंगे और मार्क्स के व्यूज़ देखेंगे। सबसे पहले है फिलोसफिकल बेसिस। इसमें जो मार्क्स की व्यूज़ है वो किस तरीके की है? मैटेरियलिज्म के बेसिस पर। ओके, नेक्स्ट है नेचर ऑफ डेवलपमेंट। इसमें क्या है? डायलैक्टिकल। इनकी व्यूज़ में क्या है? डायलैक्टिकल। नेक्स्ट मीडियम ऑफ प्रोग्रेस, क्लास कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, अल्टीमेट एंड ऑफ डेवलपमेंट, क्लासलेस एंड स्टेटलेस सोसाइटी। ओके, सो अब हम हिस्टोरिकल मैटेरियलिज्म में प्रोसेस ऑफ हिस्टोरिकल डेवलपमेंट को समझेंगे। सो अब हम इसे एक टेबल के थ्रू समझेंगे जिसमें हम वन बाय वन चीज़ों को समझने की कोशिश करेंगे। सबसे पहले देखिए सोसाइटी। सोसाइटी में दो चीज़ें होती है, फर्स्ट बेस, सेकंड सुपरस्ट्रक्चर। बेस में क्या आता है? मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में देखेंगे हम, और सुपरस्ट्रक्चर में क्या है? लीगल एंड पॉलिटिकल स्ट्रक्चर होते हैं, रिलीजन, मॉरल्स, सोशल प्रैक्टिसेस, लिटरेचर, आर्ट, कल्चर, ये सब। नेक्स्ट हम बात कर रहे हैं मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की। मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में हम क्या देख रहे हैं? फोर्सेज ऑफ प्रोडक्शन। फोर्सेज ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में हम दो चीज़ें देख रहे हैं, फर्स्ट मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन। मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन क्या क्या होते हैं? टूल्स एंड इक्विपमेंट्स, ये होते हैं हमारे मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन। उसके बाद हम देख रहे हैं लेबर पावर। लेबर पावर में क्या है? ह्यूमन नॉलेज एंड स्किल्स। ओके, नेक्स्ट हम क्या देख रहे हैं? रिलेशंस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन। इसमें भी हम दो चीज़ें देख रहे हैं, फर्स्ट सोशल फॉर्मेशंस। सोशल फॉर्मेशंस में हम क्या देख रहे हैं? कॉन्टेंटिंग क्लासेस। कॉन्टेंटिंग क्लासेस मतलब जैसे स्वामी और दास यानी स्लेव। नेक्स्ट हम देख रहे हैं स्लेव ओनिंग सोसाइटी। इसमें हम क्या देखेंगे? मास्टर एंड स्लेव। ओके, यानी जमींदार, किसान। नेक्स्ट फ्यूडल सोसाइटी। फ्यूडल सोसाइटी में हम देख रहे हैं लॉर्ड एंड सेल्फ। कैपिटलिस्ट सोसाइटी में कैपिटलिस्ट एंड वर्कर, ये दोनों काम करते हैं, ये दोनों एक दूसरे से जुड़े होते हैं। ठीक है, ओके, नाउ मार्क्सिज्म ऑन द क्लास डिवीजन ऑफ सोसाइटी। इसमें भी हम दो चीज़ों से समझेंगे। सबसे पहले क्लासेस को देखते हैं। सबसे पहले हेव्स, जो कि क्या होते हैं? प्रोडक्शन यानी कि मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन के स्वामी होते हैं, जो जिनके पास ओनरशिप होती है। नेक्स्ट होते हैं हेव्स नॉट, जो कि होते हैं वर्कर क्लास, जो कि गरीब होते हैं, जो अपनी लाइफ को जीने के लिए क्या करते हैं? अपनी लेबर पावर को बेचते हैं। किसको बेचते हैं? कैपिटलिस्ट को। ओके, जिनके पास ओनरशिप होती है। नेक्स्ट यहाँ पे है डोमिनेंट क्लास। डोमिनेंट क्लास क्या कहते हैं? डिपेंडेंट क्लास। ये दोनों एक दूसरे से जुड़े होते हैं और इन दोनों से क्या चीज़ जुड़ी है? क्लास कॉन्फ्लिक्ट। सीधी सी बात ये है, जो कि वर्कर क्लास के लोग होते हैं वो अपनी लेबर पावर क्या करते हैं? बेचते हैं। किसको बेचते हैं? कैपिटलिस्ट को, यानी कि उसके पास, जिसके पास ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा रिसोर्सेज होते हैं और जो रूल करता है। सो अब हम बात करेंगे माओ जेडोंग के बारे में। देखिए, माओ जेडोंग मॉडर्न चाइना के कम्युनिस्ट लीडर थे और फिलोसोफर भी, और जिसमें उन्होंने क्या किया, रिवॉल्यूशन के मार्क्सिस्ट थियरी और प्रैक्टिस को चाइना की कंडीशन पर ढालने की कोशिश की। सो बेसिकली माओ ने पीजेंट्री के लिए काम किया, यानी कि कृषक वर्ग के लिए। तो माओ ने पीजेंट्री को ही रिवॉल्यूशन का मेन मीडियम माना। उन्होंने क्या किया, थियरी और प्रैक्टिस को कंपेयर करते हुए परफेक्शन ऑफ बिहेवियर को करने की कोशिश की। ओके, now let's discuss everything in deep details. See, Karl Marx born at Trier in Germany in 1818. Marx studied law at the University of Bonn and later at the University of Berlin, where I got attracted to the young Hegelian movement, which was highly critical not only the Prussian government but also of Christianity. Because of his association with this anti-government movement, his career options in university or government were virtually closed. So therefore he took to journalism and became the editor of Zedong. Now he began writing radical articles on economic issues, criticizing the government's economic policies. Alright, the Prussian rulers were annoyed at his views and ordered the closure of his newspaper. So basically, Marx's 34 year stays in England is marked by two changes in him. Firstly, he moved gradually but decisively from philosophy to economics. Unlike alienation, which is the central theme of EPM, Marx now got engrossed in the analysis of the phenomena of exploitation. Alright, so he devoted his attention to serious economic questions like wage labor, capitalism, and surplus value. Secondly, he was as much involved in writing serious treatises as in leading the workers' movements in Europe. He was not merely an armchair theoretician critical of capitalism and its exploitative nature, but also revolutionary and an ideologue of communism. His most incisive work in this direction was a massive manuscript which he wrote around, but which came to light only in 1939. So Marx's stay in London was also devoted to organizing the British and French workers. In 1864, he, along with others, set up the first major organization of workers of Europe, which was named International Working Men's Association, popularly known as Communist International. It remained active up to 1876, and its brightest hour was in 1871 when it succeeded in setting up Paris Commune. Alright, now alienation. As pointed out above, Marx in his early years was attracted to Hegelian ideals, but under the influence of Feuerbach, Lie embraced communism of the humanist variety, which he articulated in his EPM. He criticized capitalism because it leads to the alienation of labor. It is only in communism that human beings will be redeemed from his phenomena. Alienation is a very complex concept. Sometimes it is equated with such concepts as estrangement, objectification, and reification. To put it in simple words, it implies dehumanization or the loss of self. So the worker in a capitalist order works in a mechanical manner and does not derive any pleasure from his work. His labor becomes a commodity which he must sell in order to survive. Alright, he is also alienated from the product of his labor, from his fellow workers, and from the natural world. So Marx argued that in a capitalist society, the worker is alienated from the product of his labor because it does not belong to him but belongs to somebody else. Now who is somebody else? The capitalist. The competitive nature of capitalism also alienates the worker from his fellow workers. In essence, the worker is alienated from his creative potentialities that are characteristics of his species being. So Marx advocated that it is only in a communist society that man will return to his real self as a free creative agent, and the work will no more remain in monotonous activity. Private property is the product and the consequence of alienated labor, and therefore its abolition will lead to redemption of man from his alienated state. Now, what is historical materialism? In the history of ideas, there are three main explanations of how the human societies have developed over the ages: the spiritualist interpretation, the idealist interpretation, and the materialist interpretation. According to the first, all developments in human history are due to divine dispensation of God's will. According to the second, it is the ideas that constitute the motor of human history. In the other words, it is the developments of idea that led to corresponding developments in all the domains of human activity. The idealist interpretation is associated mainly with Hegel. Hegel was a German thinker who preceded Marx. According to the third, which Marx expounded, all developed in human history are due to changes in the material conditions of life. In this unit, we are concerned only with the third, the materialist interpretation, which inverted the Hegelian idealist interpretation. In the idealist interpretation is the mind, which is primary and matter secondary. So, while according to Marx materialist interpretation, it is matter which is primary and the mind secondary. The doctrine of historical materialism constitutes the core of Marxian writings. It is the main theme of Marx's German ideology. It seeks to explain all historical events in terms of changes occurring in entire mode of production. The changes from primitive communism to slavery, from slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and from capitalism to socialism, and communism are all explained in terms of changes in the material conditions of society and in the lives of individuals. The mode of production consists of the forces means of production, which land, labor, capital, machine, tools, factories, etc. etc. And relations of production: slave master, serf baron, proletariat capitalist. The economic structure of each society, which is constituted by relations of production, is the real foundation of that society. It constitutes the base on which rises the legal, political, and ideological superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. This was quite the opposite of the Hegelian assertion that consciousness determines existence. So, Marx's theory of historical materialism is also dialectical. Marx borrowed the dialectical method from Hegel, who had described all the historical changes in the term of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the domain of ideas. An idea, which is thesis, according to Hegel, gives rise to a counter idea, antithesis, and finally their contradiction is resolved in a synthesis. This synthesis itself acquires the status of a thesis and gives rise to its antithesis, which is again resolved in a synthesis, and the process goes on. It is important to note that whereas Hegel had applied the dialectical method in the domain of ideas, Marx applied the dialectical method in explaining that material world as such, while the Hegelian position is characterized as dialectical idealism, that of Marx is known as dialectical materialism. Okay, now next, what is class war? See, the mode of production or the way social production is organized in a society and the way instruments of production are used for such production determines social, political, legal, and ideological character of society at a certain age. The forces of production outgrow, develop beyond the relation of production and get out of tune with the existing relation of production, which fetter the former's growth. So this contradiction between the forces of production and relations of production leads to a class war, which means a war between the class which owns the means of production and the class which owns only labor power. So basically, class war, according to Marx, has been the most prominent and recurring feature of all human societies. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx Engels wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, free man and slave, patriarchy, and plebeian lord and self guide master and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed. So when this class war reaches when this class war reaches a high watermark and contradictions become intense, it is resolved through a social revolution which ensures newer and higher relations of production corresponding to the forces or means of production. But in due course, the forces of production again outgrew the relations of production, again necessitating a social revolution. This process goes on. A marked feature of a class based society is that antagonist to contradiction arises due to divergent economic interests in order to defend two class. Alright, its class interest, the class owning the means of production, establishes its class role. No antagonism, no progress, asserted Marx. You can see from the above argument that Marx's contention is that the state in a capitalist society is a vehicle of class rule. So it follows from this argument that if classes are abolished and a classless society comes about, then the state will become redundant and gradually it will wither away. Alright. Now, what is surplus value? This is the very important theory of Karl Marx. Another important theory that Marx enunciated is the theory of surplus value. It is with the help of this concept that Marx explained the whole phenomena of exploitation in the capitalist society. To put it in simple terms, surplus value is what is normally called profit. Marx's argument is that the worker produces social objects which are sold by the capitalist for more than what the worker received as wages. So thus the worker is not paid for the whole of his labor or labor power that he spends in producing the social commodities. Some part of his labor is appropriated or stolen by the capitalist. So the theory of surplus value is rooted in the labor theory of value, that is, that value of a commodity depends on the amount of labor spent in producing it. In other words, surplus value arises because some part of the worker's labor is not paid to him. So Marx further argued that it is only in class-based society that surplus value exists because the bourgeois class exploits the proletariat. The bourgeois consist of those who own the means of production, land, capital, factories, forest, while the proletariat consists of those who own nothing but their labor power which they must sell in order to survive. So, as the surplus value increases, the worker gets paid less and less. As pointed out above, this gives rise to a sharp contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat, which is resolved finally in a proletarian revolution. This revolution will bring about the demise of capitalism. The state power will be captured by the proletariat after the capture of state power by the working class. So Marx visualized a brief period of dictatorship of the proletariat. It is during this dictatorship that the society would usher in socialism, where each will work according to capacity and get according to work. And finally, communism, where each will work according to capacity and get according to need. Thus, communism is viewed by Marx as a classless society of associated producers. So, communism for Marx was a society which revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat would bring about after capitalism is overthrown. It will also undertake positive abolition of private property and the abolition of private ownership. In a communist society, there will neither be exploitation nor alienation. Communism for Marx is the return of man to himself from his alienated condition. It is marked by abolition of classes in society. This can only be done by the proletariat by establishing its control over the means of production. Alright, so once the society becomes classless, the state will no more be required. So the capitalist state is a managing committee of the bourgeois because it facilitates the exploitation of one class by another. Therefore, in a classless society, the state will become redundant and it will wither away. So such conditions, according to Marx, existed in ancient times in the tribal societies. Now let's discuss about V.L. Lenin. Basically, he was born at Simbirsk in 1870, April 22. Lenin had normal schooling. However, when he was taking his final school examination at the age of 16, his elder brother Alexander was charged to conspiring to kill the Tsar. King in Russia was known as Tsar and was sentenced to death by the Tsarist regime. So, despite all the trauma that is even brought to Lenin, he secured the highest possible marks in the school examination. After school education, he joined the Kazan University. It was during his stay at the university that Lenin began taking part in the various student agitations, which ultimately led to his expulsion from the university. So thereafter, he involved himself fully in revolutionary activities and soon became the leader of the Marxist group at ST. Petersburg, he was arrested in 1895 by the Tsarist regime and exiled to Siberia. It was here that he wrote his first major work, which was Development of Capitalism in Russia. 1899. In this work, he described how capitalism was growing in Russia during its initial phase. In 1900, he migrated to Geneva and joined Plekhanov's revolutionary group. He also started editing a paper named Iskara, in which Lai launched an anti-Tsarist campaign. In 1902, he wrote his second important work, What is to be Done, which deals with party organization. In 1960, when the First World War had reached a very grim stage, Lenin produced his most incisive work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, wherein he analyzes the phenomena of imperialism. In October 1917, he assumed power in Russia. By doing this, Lenin earned the credit for the first successful Marxist revolution, and that too in a capitalistically less developed country like Tsarist Russia, where feudalism was deeply entrenched. Soon after the success of this revolution, Lenin started suffering from frequent strokes. His ill health forced him to gradually withdraw from the active governance of the Soviet Union. However, during the few years that Lai lived after the success of his revolution, he led the foundation of a socialist state, which his successor Joseph Stalin developed into a superpower in a short span of time. Now let's come to the next topic, which is party as vanguard of the proletariat. There are several seminal contributions of Lenin to Marxist theory of practice. In his development of capitalism in Russia, he tried to offer an interpretation of Tsarist Russia in Marxist terms. He argued that there was a large wage labor power in Russia. However, he expressed the view that this wage labor class was not fully conscious of its exploitation. He further added that only the industrial proletariat, which means factory workers, was capable of articulating the grievances of this whole class in the revolutionary direction. This could be done only by transcending local economic grievances and narrow trade unions. For this, there was a need of national level political organization. Only such an organization could raise the level of political consciousness of the workers by transforming the wage labor class into a revolutionary proletariat class capable of staging a successful revolution. Lenin indeed tried to do so in actual practice. So, the biggest task for him was to create a working class in Russia which was conscious of its exploitation. This, in his view, indeed a communist organization, but he realized that the autocratic Tsarist regime would not allow any such organization to operate openly. The only alternative was to operate underground in a clandestine manner. In short, the problem for Lenin was how to do these twin tasks, creating a national level organization of Russian wage workers and raising their level of political consciousness. The Leninist strategy on these two issues is contained in his What is to be Done. In his work, Lenin argued that in conditions prevailing in Russia, there was need of a communist party, which could act as a vanguard of the proletariat. Alright? Okay. Next. See now, democratic centralism. See, having made the Communist Party as a vanguard of the proletariat, Lenin advocated a certain type of organizational structure of the party. His thesis is popularly known as democratic centralism. To put it in simple words, democratic centralism consisted of two elements. First, democracy and centralism. It meant that the hierarchical structure of the Communist Party should be such that each higher organ of the party should be elected by the lower organ and all the party matters should initially discussed freely at all the levels of the organization from the lowest to the highest. So however, once a decision has been taken by the highest organ, it should be imposed strictly on all over the lower organs, and all of them must abide by it. While theoretically a democratic centralism has democracy as well as centralism, in actual practice, the party became less and less democratic and more centralized, like his vanguard thesis. Lenin's view on democratic centralism were also criticized by several of his contemporaries. Now, imperialism. Marx, in his analysis of capitalism, had argued that in the task overthrowing autocracy and feudalism, the bureaucracy plays a revolutionary role and brings about democracy and capitalism. This is called the bourgeois democratic revolution. It puts the bourgeois into the power. Under the rule of the bourgeois, capitalism would develop further. Finally, it would reach a stage where the class contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat would become very sharp. This would create conditions for a proletarian socialist revolution which would mark the demise of capitalism. This prediction of Marx, however, did not prove true, and the development of capitalism in Europe did not lead to proletarian socialist revolutions. So Lenin tried to explain why the Marxian prediction about the proletarian socialist revolution and demise of capitalism had not come true. Now, had capitalism received a lease of life? Now, had capitalism failed in its historical mission? Lenin, in his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, tried to explain this lease of life which capitalism is West had received. So capitalism, in his view, had grown so much that raw material and domestic markets in the capitalist countries were not enough to permit its further growth. Therefore, it had become necessary for these countries to find raw material and new markets for investment in Asia, Africa, and South America. Thus, capitalism was exported from Europe. It had acquired a monopolistic position and had become reactionary. So, due to colonization of Asia, Africa, and South America, capitalism had acquired a parasitic position. Thus, capitalism had reached its highest stage, imperialism, and had exhausted the historical mission of creating conditions. Okay. So, for a proletarian revolution in different capitalist countries, however, capitalism in its imperialist manifestation had created conditions for a socialist revolution at the global stage. Okay. Now, weakest link of the chain. The success of the Bolshevik Revolution in capitalistically underdeveloped countries like Russia in 1917 raised two new problems for Lenin. The first problem was to reconcile and interpret this revolution in Marxian terms. Lenin did so by inventing the weakest link of the chain argument. It meant that Tsarist Russia, where capitalism was not yet fully developed, constituted the weakest link of the imperialist chain, and strategically it is quite appropriate to break the chain at its weakest rather than at its strongest point. In fact, this whole idea is also implicit in Marx. Marx had argued that with slight development of capitalism, the bourgeois becomes stronger and stronger, but it also gives rise to its equally powerful gravediggers, that is, the proletariat class. So the bourgeois cannot grow strong without leading to simultaneous growth of proletariat. So in societies where the bourgeois is strong, the proletariat is also strong. Similarly, where the bourgeois is weak, the proletariat is also weak. The Leninist argument was that the capitalistically advanced countries of Europe constituted the strongest point of the imperialist chain, while Tsarist Russia constituted the weakest chain. So the second problem for Lenin was more serious. Since the revolution had occurred in Tsarist Russia, where capitalism was still unripe, the problem was to draw a plan for building a socialist state. The problem got further compounded because Marx, in his writings, had given a very sketchy picture of the socialist state and had not explained in detail how a socialist society would come about. So, the capitalist state, according to Lenin, emerged as an organ of class rule. It was a special organization of force and violence for the exploitation of the working class. This capitalist state had to be replaced by a socialist state. In his State and Revolution, Lenin offered some outlines of his strategy to build such a socialist state in Russia. He argued that the bureaucratic military state was to be replaced by Soviets modeled on the lines of the Paris Commune. Moreover, he did not subscribe fully to the Marxist notion of withering away of the state. Instead, he began to argue that during the transitional phase, the communists could use the state apparatus to achieve their political and economic goals. It meant that it may be necessary to fight with a mixed economy, for sometimes private and public sectors could coexist. Till the public sector is strong enough to take over the task of social reconstruction, only then the possibility of withering away of the state would be there. Now, let's discuss about Mao Zedong. See, he was born at Shaoxing in Yunnan province of China in 1893, December 26. Mao is the second Marxist revolutionary, Lenin being the first, who brought about a successful revolution in a backward country like China. Moreover, he did so primarily with the help of the peasantry, a class which Marx thought had no revolutionary potential. Even Lenin had not placed much faith in the peasant class. Mao, like Lenin, was both a practitioner of Marxism, also its theoretician. After a little formal education, he joined the army of Hunan province during the 1911 revolution led by Communist KMT, a bourgeois nationalist party of Sun Yat-sen. Soon after the success of KMT revolution, he moved to capital of Hunan and later to Peking, now Beijing. It was here that he came under the influence of the radical Marxist leader Li Dezhou, who arranged a job for him in the university library. However, he left the job and returned to Changsha and became active in the Communist Party of China (CPC). Between 1921 to 25, he organized the mine workers. He also traveled to various parts of China, which gave him a first-hand impression about the exploitative conditions under which the Chinese peasantry was reeling at that time. So this was a period of cooperation between the KMT and the CPC. However, tension between the two began to develop when the CPC pressed for agrarian reforms which were not acceptable to the KMT because they were bound to adversely affect the interests of the KMT members, many of whom were landlords. By 1927, the relations between the KMT and the CPC became so bitter that the KMT decided to hit at the communists after this break between the KMT and the CPC. So Mao was asked to organize a rebellion of Hunan peasants. During the course of this rebellion, Mao wrote his first major work, which was Analysis of Classes in the Chinese Society. Here he identified the various strata of Chinese peasantry, small, marginal, middle, and the big peasant, and the revolutionary potential of each of them. He highlighted the contradiction between the peasantry and the feudal lords. He argued that in the Chinese condition, the peasantry was going to be vanguard of the revolution. Unlike Tsarist Russia, where revolution was led by the proletariat, he also identified lies strata which could be reliable and vacillating, allies in a peasant-led revolution. He attempted the harvest uprising of peasants in 1928, but the uprising was crushed and Mao had to flee along with his supporters to Chinkansha, now Jingansha mountains. From these mountains, Mao's party started its guerrilla warfare tactics. By this, Mao became the originator of guerrilla warfare within the Marxist revolutionary framework. By these tactics, the CPC was able to capture various parts of southeast China. It set up a number of peasant Soviets in the captured area. These successes of the CPC in rural China, however, were not according to the policy laid down by the Communist International, which had been advocating that the revolution must begin from the urban centers. So the urban center revolution, Mao thought, was bound to fail in China because there was a very small proletariat. Therefore, he continued his guerrilla warfare tactics in the rural areas. So finally, the KMT and MICE drove out of the revolutionaries who took shelter in the northwest hills of China. This escape became famous as Mao's Long March. This also made Man the undisputed leader of the CPC, a position which he maintained till his death. So, Mao's state in the northwest Yan'an province was the most fruitful period of the CPC. It was here that Mao began an extensive study of Marxist philosophy. Mao is believed to have written two serious pieces during this period, one titled On Practice and the other called On Contradiction, both of which were published after the success of the Chinese Revolution in the 1940s. He gave a blueprint of the future Chinese government titled New Democracy.